Welcome to Surrender School.
So we're going to learn a little bit about Joe and Charley first and foremost. Joe and Charley were both members of AA, and Joe came into AA in 1962, and Charley came into 1970. But they didn't meet until 1973. They were at an Al-Anon convention in which Joe was the MC, and he was going to be introducing the AA speaker, which happened to be Charley P. And Charley and he, during this time in which Charley spoke, Joe started to realize that Charley has a very strong grasp of understanding of the big book. So they got together afterwards and they started talking and realized that they had a mutual like for the book. They had a mutual understanding of how important the information in the big book was. So they started to study it. Not only did they study the book, but they started to study the history of the book, in which we will be covering today. So pretty soon they got together and they were starting to meet. They were driving up to 200 miles, a little over 200 miles, just to meet with each other to study this book together. And then soon they were planning to meet at conventions. And before long, someone was asked them to come to their home group and present this. And when they were there, he said, "Oh, by the way, would you allow us to record you doing this big book study? We think it's so important for us to get the word out, because many of us just don't know the big book well enough, and certainly don't know the history of it well enough for it to be understood." So they allowed him to record it, and they became the Joe and Charley tapes. So that's what people will refer to, the Joe and Charley tapes. Now, these recordings can be found all over YouTube. Many websites have them. They've allowed people to republish them, thus allowing me to get the information today. Also, one of the hopes for Joe and Charley that they said is they want us to be able to pass this on. One of the reasons I want to make this available to you, so that if you want to take these presentations back and use them for any reason, you can manipulate them if you want to. Just please put your email in the chat and I'll make sure you get an actual copy that's editable. All right. With that being said, let's look at the AA history, a little bit of the AA history. So once again, anything in orange is going to be a link, a direct link to the recordings. And we'll start with the introduction. We're going to hear Joe and Charley's voice in just a moment as they introduce themselves. And then they'll go into the vital spiritual experience. And that's the introduction, really, of Bill W. And then we'll go on to Dr. Silkworth and the Oxford group, how they had to come, how that information from Dr. Silkworth and the Oxford group had to come together so that they'd have an understanding of how to write this big book, which we'll get to in a few moments. And then they talked about spiritual matters. And the bar that they talk about is actually at Mayflower, in which it was in Akron, Ohio, in which the most important phone call ever made is what they often call that, from that bar. And Mother's Day, what they're talking about there is that's the day that Bill and Bob met. And then we'll go into a little bit about Bill and Bob's meeting, their spiritual experience. And then we'll start talking about AA number 3, which is Bill Dodson. And we'll go on to the drunk squad of the Oxford group. That's what they were called when they were starting to have meetings. When the first AA was developed, but they didn't know it just yet. We'll talk about how Bill took that information from Akron, Ohio, back to New York City, where he was from. And then we'll talk about the development of the big book and how the treatment center impacted what the rooms look like today, even, and what the newcomer can expect. And then we'll look at the layout of the books and the steps. Now, what we can't cover today, what's available to us, is the preface and what's called the algebra problem, of basically the layout of the book again, and then the recovery section. Those are available to you. And at the end of this, the last slide will be how you can go directly to those locations and listen to that on your own time. But it's probably not going to be relevant for what we need today, but I will cover it in the review of next week. So this is Joe and this is Charley. Joe came into AA in 1962 at a time in which African Americans were, Black people were really, not treated the same back in that time. But he persevered, and he was one of the first African American members in Little Rock, Arkansas, and also in, I forget the other city at the moment, but that is Joe. And then there's Charlie P there, and he's from Arkansas, but he's from Maysville, Arkansas, and he came into AA in 1970. But they didn't meet once again until 1973. So let's hear what they have to say for their introduction.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic. And it's truly by God's grace and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that I found in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm sober today, and for that I'm very, very thankful. Charlie.
Hi, everybody. My name is Charlie Parmlett. I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic.
Hi, Charlie.
Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found in the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found necessary to take a drink for 10,516 days today, one day at a time, and for this I'm grateful. We always like to say as we start one of these things that we do not consider ourselves to be the gurus of the Big Book Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't consider ourselves to be the experts on anything at all. We're just two old drunks, met together several years ago, found we had a mutual interest in the Big Book. We studied it together for quite some time. Hopefully, we've learned a few things about it. And those few things we've learned about it, we just love to be able to share them with other people. We do not attempt to speak for AA as a whole, and you are most certainly free to agree or disagree with anything that we say throughout the entire weekend as you see fit. In fact, if you hear us saying things that can't be reconciled with what's in the Big Book Alcoholics Anonymous, we suggest you just don't pay any attention to those things. And we'll do our best to keep most of our conversation centered on the book itself. If we're going...
And once again, I will reiterate that if there's anything that you can't reconcile with what you've read in the Big Book, I ask that you just bring it to my attention gently, and I will certainly correct it for the next week for sure. But I will try to focus on only what I've read here and focus on the Big Book. One of the things that you're going to hear in just a moment is that Bill lays out the book in a particular way. He does this with all of his writings, and you're going to hear Joe talk about this in just a moment.
Going to study the Big Book Alcoholics Anonymous, which of course that's what we're here for this weekend. I think it would be well if we would go back and look at just a little bit of the history behind the book, be able to see what happened to some of the first people that put this thing together. And by looking at that history, then it's going to make it a lot easier to understand the book itself as we go through that. And what we like to do to look at some of the history is go to the forward to the second edition, Roman numeral 15, and we'll start with the last paragraph on that page. So everybody that's got your books, if you're ready, Roman numeral 15, and the last paragraph on that page, Joe.
One of the things that's helped me over the years in studying Bill's writings, and he does this in most all of his writings. If you kind of follow along with what he does, and you help you understand some of his writings. For instance, he'll always tell us what the problem is. Then he'll just tell us the solution to that problem. And then he'll give us a practical program of action to implement the solution that he just described.
And what he just said is vitally important, because as we go through this, you'll hear they'll be referring to the problem, the solution, and the program of action over and over and over again. I honestly didn't see the pattern until I was doing this Big Book study at this time. I started to see that Bill does offer what is the problem, there is a solution, and then he shows the actions that need to be taken to implement the solution. I certainly did see that. So with that being said, we are now going to start to get introduced in the introduction of the forward to the second edition, which is on Roman numeral 16. We are looking at that. So if you have your big book, feel free to follow along. If not, on the next screen, you will see the actual what we're going to be talking about. That very last paragraph close to the bottom of that page.
And understanding how Bill writes. So at the bottom of the page, on Roman numeral page 15, he said the spark that was to flare in the first AA group was struck in Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician.
And we know that New York stockbroker to be this fellow named Bill Wilson. I think we're treating Bill pretty good when we call him a New York stockbroker. He really wasn't. He was a New York City stock speculator. He made his living out of selling fast, talking to slow-thinking people. I don't want to take anything away from Bill because he's a great man. But I think we all need to realize that he's a real alcoholic, just like all the rest of us. And understanding that, it'll make it easier to understand the book. Because after all, Bill is the primary author of the book.
Reiterating that Bill is the primary author, but he wasn't the only author. And Bill had to know a lot of information before this book could be written and before he even got to the point where he was even thinking about a book. So what we're going to see is that Bill was visited by one of his friends, and you're going to see at the top of the page, Roman numeral 16, I think is going to be the page we're going to be looking at. We're going to start talking about him getting a visit from one of his friends. And that friend, we now know, is Ebby Thatcher, and that is spelled correctly. I had to look it up. But that is how he actually spells his name. But Ebby was somewhat of a town drunk. He was also one of Bill's drinking friends. And what we saw is that he and Bill got together. He visited Bill rather, and he was sober, and Bill hadn't seen that in a while. So let's hear what they say on Roman numeral page 16, where it says 6 months earlier at the top of the page.
6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the octa groups of that day.
A little later on, we're going to get into Bill's story, and we're going to see in Bill's story where he had what he always called a vital spiritual experience in the town hospital in December of 1934. But prior to him having that spiritual experience, certain things had to take place in Bill's life. And one of the things was that this meeting with the alcoholic friend took place in the latter part of November 1934. And this was a fellow named Ebby Thatcher. And Ebby Thatcher came with Bill and sat down with Bill in Bill's kitchen. And he gave Bill what turned out to be two vital pieces of information.
And we're going to hear what he had to say to Bill. So he has visited Bill, and he's showing Bill, wow, Bill, I'm sober. I got to give you this information. And he's telling Bill, the people like you and I, Bill, are absolutely powerless. Let's hear what they had to say about it.
Like you and I, who have become absolutely powerless over alcohol, if we're going to recover from that condition, we're going to have the aid of a power greater than human power. He said the doctors and the ministers and the psychiatrists have tried to help people like us, but the human power doesn't seem to be able to do the job. And he said we'll have the aid of a power greater than human power. And he said, I've been attending meetings with a group of people called the Oxford Groupers. And they told me if I could have a spiritual experience, that during that spiritual experience I would be able to find that power, and I would be able to recover from alcoholism. He said also they have given me a practical program of action, and they guaranteed me if I would follow that program of action, I would have the spiritual experience, I would find the power, and I would be able to recover from alcoholism. Look at me, Bill. It's been 2 months since I've had a drink. Now, Bill knew about Ebby Thatcher, and he knew how Ebby drank. In fact, Bill had always said, if I ever get as bad as Eddie Thatcher, I'm going to quit drinking. And here's Ebbie sitting in Bill's kitchen, and Bill is about 2/3 drunk, and Ebbie's been sober for 2 months. This made a great impression on Bill when he told him of the solution, the vital spiritual experience, and he told him of the practical program of action necessary to have that spiritual experience. But that isn't everything Bill had to know. Let's go a little further.
And going a little bit further, we also find that Bill also had to have some information from Dr. Silkworth. And Dr. Silkworth was a physician who specialized in the treatment of alcoholism. He worked at the Towns Hospital, or Charles B. Towns Hospital, for drug and alcohol addiction in New York City in the 1930s. And that is where he met Bill. And he had sobered Bill up at least, it would be 4 times as the total count is what they said. But he had to get information from Dr. Silkworth as well. Remember, he got some information from Ebby. Now he's getting information from Dr. Silkworth. Let's hear what that information is. And if you're still following along with me, we're still on the forward to the second edition. And I think it's like the second paragraph down, page Roman numeral 16.
He had also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who is now counted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. And from this doctor, the broker learned the grave nature of alcoholism.
Again, as we get into Bill's story, we'll be able to see how as far back as the summer of 1933, Bill was placed in the Towns Hospital for withdrawal from alcohol by Dr. Silkworth. And after he had been in there a few days and his mind kind of cleared up, Dr. Silkworth sat down with Bill and began to explain to him his ideas about this thing concerning alcoholism.
And Dr. Silkworth had a lot of good information to tell Bill. And because he didn't really believe that alcoholism was a matter of willpower. He didn't believe that it was moral character. He didn't even think it was a sin. But he had more information. He really thought it was an illness of the body and an obsession of the mind. So let's hear what Charley had to say about that. And by the way, these pictures were taken from a website, and anything, once again, in orange, you can click on the link when you get this file, and it'll take you straight to the location in where I got the information.
I believe that alcoholism is a matter of willpower. I do not believe it's a matter of moral character, and I don't think sin's got anything to do with it. He said, I believe people like you are suffering from an illness. And he said it seems to be a very peculiar illness. It's a twofold illness. An illness of the body as well as an illness of the mind. And he said, I think what has happened to people like you is you have become absolutely physically allergic to alcohol. And it seemed to me as though any time you put any alcohol whatsoever into your system, it develops an actual physical craving, which makes it virtually impossible for you to stop drinking after you have once started. And he said because of that allergy, which produces that physical craving, you'll never be able to safely drink alcohol again. And he said you also have developed what we refer to as an obsession of the mind. And he said an obsession of the mind is an idea that overcomes all other ideas to the contrary. And he said it really doesn't make any difference how badly you want to stop drinking. From time to time, your obsession of the mind to drink will be so strong that it will overcome any ideas not to drink, and your mind will actually lead you to believing it's okay to take a drink. And he said, then you'll take that drink, and then you'll trigger that allergy, and you'll be unable to stop. He said, you can't safely drink because of your body. You can't stay sober because of your mind. Therefore, you've become absolutely powerless over alcohol.
Wow. I'm going to repeat that back one more time. Dr. Silkworth gave Bill this information. You can't safely drink because of your body, because of the illness of the body, because you have an allergy. And you can't stay sober because of your mind, because you have an obsession. Even when you're not drinking, your obsession is heightened. Therefore, you've become absolutely powerless over alcohol. And I don't think it's just alcohol for some of us on this call today. I think there are other substances that we certainly have an allergy in our body and an obsession in our mind. So this still holds true for me today, for sure. So Bill knew that he had a physical allergy. He knew this information a year prior, but he still ended up getting drunk. So let's find out what else Dr. Silkworth had to say to him.
Bill knew that in the summer of 1933, but knowing the problem didn't solve it, because shortly after that his mind told him it was okay to drink. And he took a drink and triggered the allergy and drank for another year. In the summer of 1934, he was placed back in the hospital again to be withdrawn from alcohol by Dr. Silkworth. And this time, Dr. Silkworth pronounced him incurable and told Bill's wife, Lois, that this guy is either going to die from DTs or he's going to become completely insane from a wet brain, and you're going to have to lock him up or hire a bodyguard if you expect him to live. And Bill overheard that, and he said this time fear sobered him for a bit. But then on Armistice Day, 1934, his mind told him it was okay to drink. And he took a drink and triggered the allergy and couldn't stop drinking. It's only after Ebby came to see him and gave him a solution to that problem and gave him a program of action that Bill was able to recover. So basically, he had to know three things. He had to know the problem. He got that from Dr. Silkworth. He had to know the solution and the program of action. That came to him from Ebby. And then Bill was able to have his spiritual experience and recover from alcoholism.
That's just as a reminder, even though he knew the information, it didn't make a difference until he had the vital spiritual experience, or until Ebby Thatcher, one alcoholic to another alcoholic, came to him and had a conversation, that he started to understand the actual magnitude of the disease that he was fighting. So, but Bill also, what started happening around this time is that Ebby started to take Bill to the Oxford group meetings, because Bill was not yet in the Oxford group. Now, Dr. Bob was, but Bill was not in the Oxford group. But Ebby started taking him to meetings. And in these meetings, one of the principles of the Oxford group is they surrender one's life over to God's plan. That was always their preachings and their teachings of the Oxford group. So as we continue on in the forward to the second edition, you're going to hear a little bit more information of some information that he gathered from Dr. Silkworth.
And Ebby began to take Bill to these Oxford group meetings after that. And he says, though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford group, he was convinced of the need of moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution of those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God, which were the tenets of the Oxford group, which were later on expanded into the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he succeeded only in keeping sober himself. After Bill got out of the hospital that last time, he began to try to help other people. He began to go out and sing them up out of the gutters and take them to these Oxford group meetings. He began to go into the bars and dragging them off a bar stool and taking them to the Oxford group meetings. Most of them didn't want to go, but he was taking them anyhow. He's trying to sober up the world. He had lots of enthusiasm. But after a few months of trying to do this, nobody was staying sober but Bill. And he went to Lois and he said, Lois, I'm trying to help these alcoholics stay sober. Nobody seems to want to stay sober. And she said, why don't you go talk to Dr. Silkworth and see what he has to say? So he went over to talk to Dr. Silkworth and told him the same story. And Dr. Silkworth said, yes, I've heard some of the shenanigans you're pulling out there on the streets. He said, Bill, you're staying sober, so obviously trying to help other people is helping you stay sober. Mm-hmm. And he said, you're talking to those drunks about that great spiritual experience that you had, and the drunk just won't accept that. He said, why don't you do for them what I did for you? Why don't you talk to them about the illness of alcoholism? Talk to them about the physical allergy and the obsession of the mind. Show them through your experience how that worked for you. And if they will accept that, then maybe you can talk to them about spiritual matters.
And as you will recall here in this, after he went to go see Dr. Silkworth. Remember, Lois actually sent him over to Dr. Silkworth, Lois being his wife, sent him over to Dr. Silkworth to talk to him. And what they started to discover and what Bill realized is that by him trying to help another alcoholic, he himself was staying sober. But he wasn't trying to give that to the other alcoholics. He was just telling them about the spiritual experience. So let's see what else Dr. Silkworth had to say. He did tell Bill, he said, every alcoholic has two questions, but you're talking to them about the spirituality, but really what they really want to know is, why can't I drink like I used to? And why can't I quit now that I want to? So let's see what Charley has to say about that.
Bill, every alcoholic I know has two questions. Number one, why can't I drink like I used to without getting drunk all the time? And number two, why can't I quit drinking now that I want to? And he said, if you will explain to them the exact nature of the illness, tell them about the physical allergy of the body and the obsession of the mind, you'll get their attention. And he said, then after you get their attention, you can talk to them about spirituality, but tell them what the problem is first. Now, our book said the broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. And that alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician.
And as you know, the Akron physician is going to be Dr. Bob. So once again, he's trying to get people sober by telling them the spiritual experience, but, he wasn't really talking about the alcoholism portion of it. So let's see what else he had to know in order to be able to start to develop a program of action. So in the history of this, Bill did travel to Akron, Ohio. I know this is a lot of information on this screen here, but he did travel to Akron, Ohio, and he was there in a business venture. And that business venture did not go well, and it failed. And now he is at the Mayflower Hotel, standing in the lobby, and he's looking over there and seeing that lobby bar, the bar, and it's starting to, speak to him, and he's feeling low, he's feeling dejected. This business deal that they traveled all the way from New York to Akron, Ohio for just fell through. So he's looking over at that bar like he really wanted to take a drink, but then he had a realization. When I was helping people in New York, I stayed sober, so I better find me another person that's, another drunk to work with, so that I can stay sober today. So he went over to this bank of elevators that's in the Mayflower Hotel, and he started looking for information of churches. And one of the churches on the list was an Oxford Group church. And since he had been going to Oxford Group meetings, he thought, well, it wouldn't hurt to call him. So he called. And he met up, he got to speak with Henrietta Seiberling. Henrietta, it was a friend of Ann Smith, which is Dr. Bob's wife. So that's how they got connected. And he called Henrietta, or he called his church, and Henrietta answered. And he said, hey, I'm in New York City. I'm from New York City, and I may have a solution for alcoholism. Do you know of any alcoholics that I can work with? And she said, oh, yeah, I definitely know an alcoholic you can work with. Let me call and see if I can set something up. So that night, they didn't meet. This was the day before Mother's Day. This was on a Saturday. So the day before Mother's Day was going to be the next day. So he calls. Henrietta calls Ann, talks to Ann, and she's like, hey, got a guy who has a solution for alcoholism. Do you think you can get Dr. Bob over there to see him? She's, oh no, Dr. Bob is not in any condition to be going out anywhere. He is, he's 3 sheets to the wind. And so she said, you think you can get him sobered up and get him over to see him? But tomorrow morning, and I'll make the arrangements. And that's what happened. So Ann got after Bob the next morning. She got after Dr. Bob the next morning. She's like, yeah, you got to go see this guy. He has a solution for alcoholism. And what a lot of people don't know is that Dr. Bob had been going to Oxford group meetings and he had heard all of their preachings, but he was never able to apply it in a manner in which allowed him to stay sober. So with Henrietta and Anne ganging up on him, so to speak, to get him to speak with Bill W. They met, and Dr. Bob was like, he's only going to get 15 minutes. I'm only going to get 15 minutes, and then I'm going home. And the reports, or so says the history notes here, that they stayed in that room for literal hours talking. And when they finished, Dr. Bob came out of that room and he says, "This is the first man I've ever met that knows what he's talking about with alcoholism." So it was a wonderful meeting, and that is the most important phone call was to Henrietta Seiberling, who connected Bill W. with Dr. Bob. Now moving on to Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob Smith was also the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous because he's AA number 2. And he came into the rooms, he and Bill met, and they started having some discussions. And let's see what happens once they've met.
What happened to him?
He said the physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but it failed.
Bill was surprised to find out Dr. Bob was already in the Oxford groups. He knew more about the solution, the spiritual experience, and the program of action that Bill knew. But he had never been able to apply it to the depth necessary to recover, because he didn't know what was wrong with him. You see, he thought it was willpower. He thought it was moral character. He thought it was sin. Why would he not? That's what everybody had told him up until that time. And what really interested him was the message that Bill had to carry regarding the problem, not the solution, not the program of action, but what alcoholism really consists of.
He said, but when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and his hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950.
Isn't that funny that it took hearing Dr. Silkworth's words to Dr. Bob Smith for him to get the fact? Remember, he'd been trying to apply the tenets of the Oxford group. And so now Dr. Silkworth gives Bill this information. Bill transfers this information over to Dr. Bob, and Dr. Bob got sober and never to drink again to his death in 1950. So I thought that was pretty amazing that the role that Dr. Silkworth played to hear Dr. Bob, to allow Dr. Bob to hear the message of recovery. Now we're going to go into the Florida second edition, and we're going to start looking at the more information that Bill and Bob had to know in order to put the program of action in place.
Now this seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. Through the sharing of our story with a new person, we can affect them as no non-alcoholic could, because we have immediate identification about the physical allergy, about the obsession of the mind, about the way we think and the things that we do. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. Remember, Bill was about to get drunk, and he really didn't go see Dr. Bob to sober up Dr. Bob. He went to see Dr. Bob to keep Bill Wilson from drinking. So it proved that night that working with another alcoholic was vital for our own recovery, too.
So Bill stays sober. Now Dr. Bob is sober. Now Dr. Bob needs to work with somebody. He's got to start working with somebody in order to see if this thing really works. So they had to find themselves another alcoholic. Now this is when we're going to start talking about Bill Dodson. But first, what happened is Dr. Bob calls the hospital where he worked, where he was practicing. And he asked him if there's any alcoholics on the ward that night. And the nurse told him, yeah, we have an alcoholic down here. And he's pretty bad, actually. And Dr. Bob said, put him in a room by himself, put him in a private room, and we'll be down in the morning, because we think we found a solution to this alcohol thing. And the nurse kind of stopped and she says, Dr. Bob, have you tried this yourself? So nonetheless, though, they are now going to go meet with the alcoholic. And that alcoholic, as we know, is AA number 3, and that's Bill Dodson. And Bill Dodson came into the mix here in June 1935, and he and Bill, excuse me, I'm sorry, Bob and Bill went over to see Bill Dodson, and Bill Dodson listened to them. He listened to them talk about their alcoholism. He listened to them talk about their solution that they're doing, and then they gave him the information, and he went home. And a little later on, he asked his wife to get his clothes, and he went home and he started applying the programs of action that he had gotten from Dr. Bob and Bill W. And he had a vital spiritual experience, and he recovered from alcoholism, and he never drank again to the day that he died. So he's AA number 3. So now they're starting to think, I know I got to work with some other people. So they put these tenets in place. And so there's what they started to see is that there is a group that is now formed, although they didn't know it. So Bill has to go back home to New York City at this point. And so the Oxford group in Akron, Ohio now has Dr. Bob, and it has Bill Dodson, and they started working with other alcoholics and trying to sober up people as well in the Oxford group area. So they had developed AA, only they didn't know what it was going to be called. So remember, Bill W. had to go back to New York City, and he took all the information that he did learn in Akron, Ohio, back to New York City. Let's hear what happens.
So when the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. You know, this little group of alcoholics that was going to the Oxford group, you know, they were having troubles with the Oxford group because the Oxford groups had 4 absolutes. And the drunks were having trouble being absolutely anything, as we well know. They couldn't practice that. And it seemed like that these drunks liked to stand off in a corner someplace and drink coffee and smoke cigarettes and tell stories, not necessarily mix in with the other Oxford group meeting members. So they began to call them the drunk squad of the Oxford groups. And that's what they liked, to separate themselves from the normal Oxford group members.
The book says a second small group had promptly taken shape at New York. When Bill went back to New York City, he began to apply there what he had learned in Akron. Instead of talking about spirituality, he talked to the new people there about the exact nature of the illness. And sure enough, he got their attention. Some of them began to respond, and a second little group started in New York City. And besides, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York and were trying to form AA groups in other cities. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic.
So right about that time, Bill has to come back to Akron, Ohio for another business venture. And so he met up with Dr. Bob at Dr. Bob's Kitchen, and they wanted to start counting and seeing how many people were actually staying sober with 3 principles that they, with this problem solution and program of action that they were using to help people. Let's see what happens next.
37, Bill was back in Akron, again on a business venture. And he decided to go by and see Dr. Bob and see how things were going in Akron. And they sat down in Dr. Bob's kitchen and they counted the number of people they knew that were staying sober based on these 3 little pieces of information. And they found approximately 40 people sober. And I think that's the first time that they really began to realize maybe we really have found the answer to this thing called alcoholism. And if we found the answer, then we need to get it to as many alcoholics as we possibly can. So the question immediately becomes, well, what's the best way to do that? And maybe this is the beginning of the group conscience. Because Bill and Bob decided they didn't want to make that decision themselves. It was too important.
I agree. That was a very important decision, and it was one that would ultimately save the lives of many people by their next action. So those people got together. They called a meeting. He was in Akron, Ohio. They called a meeting in the Akron, Ohio area. And there were 18 people. Some were alcoholic, some were non-alcoholic. And they started to contemplate, how can we get this message out to the vast majority of people? Because there are several people suffering. So let's see what they had to say about that.
The meeting of the Oxford group there in Akron. And at that meeting that night, there was 18 people there, some alcoholic, some non-alcoholic. And the topic of conversation was, how can we best carry this message of recovery to the greatest number of people? Now, they decided that night to do three things. So they decided, now remember, this is in the midst of the Depression now in 1932. Nobody has a dime, hardly at all. And they decided what they needed to do was to build a chain of hospitals stretching all the way across the United States, where any alcoholic that needed it would be able to have detoxification. They also felt that this little message of recovery they had was so vital that not everybody could be entrusted with carrying it correctly. So they decided they needed to hire a group of individuals, train them, and then let them spread out across the United States, more or less as missionaries, to carry this message of recovery. And then they said, you know, the Oxford groups have written a lot of books, spiritual in nature, and they've been very popular. And they felt that if they could come up with a book on alcoholism, what it is and the solution to it, and a way to bring that about, the first comprehensive book on alcoholism the world had ever seen, that then surely this book would become one of the world's greatest bestsellers. And they can take the profits from the book and build the hospitals and train the missionaries. And behind the book was that they had already noticed, carrying this message one-on-one, one person to another, that it already had begun to be changed. But we'll usually add just a little bit to it. And then the next one will add a little more and a little more and a little more, and after a while it doesn't resemble the first thing. And they said what we really need to do is take these three pieces of information about the problem, the solution, and a program of action, put it down in a written form where it will no longer be changed, no longer be garbled, and any alcoholic anywhere in the world in the future would have this same information, and it would be pure.
So this determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women.
So yeah, they were going to build hospitals, and they were going to do missionaries, and they were so on and so forth. But realizing that they couldn't afford to do that, they wrote the book, which ultimately this is where we are now. So once again, the determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939. Let's hear what Charlie has to, or excuse me, what Joe has to read about that, and he has some more information for us.
So this determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. And after they wrote the book, they sat down one night at a meeting and they were trying to determine what they're going to call the book. And then one evening someone suggested that we're alcoholics and we want to remain anonymous. How about Anonymous Alcoholics, or Alcoholics Anonymous? That caught on. And so that's what they call the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And the first Alcoholics Anonymous that the world has ever seen was a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. And it says here, this fledgling society, this drunk squad of the Oxford group, which had been nameless now, began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. So we have two Alcoholics Anonymous, don't we? We have a book entitled Alcoholics Anonymous, and then we have a fellowship entitled Alcoholics Anonymous. Two AAs, and we still have that today.
Now, I think this is very important for us to think about. This group of people who had been nameless, or who had been known as the drunk squad of the Oxford groups, wrote a book, and in that book, they put their program of recovery. and they called the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Then after the book was published, they then decided to call themselves Alcoholics Anonymous.
So that is how AA got their name. Alcoholics Anonymous, the book, and Alcoholics Anonymous, the program. So then now they've written the book and they are publishing the book, and the first person gets in, they read and they study and they do what it says and they start their own group. And along about that time was probably late 40s, early 50s, we're starting to see treatment centers come into play for people who were suffering with these substances. And they were getting this message from AA's Big Book, but it was starting to be a different message. So let's hear what Charley had to say about that.
Now, in 1939, the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous and the program in the fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous were exactly the same. The book then began to go out across the United States. And the first person out here in California got a copy of this book. Read it, studied it, did what it said, recovered from alcoholism, started a group called Alcoholics Anonymous. But the fellowship, as it grew and got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they began to experience the power of fellowship, they then began to question the need for the severity of the program in the book. And they said, do you mean we really have to turn all of our will and our life over to the care of God as we understand Him? Couldn't we give Him the drinking and keep the rest? Do you mean we're going to have to share all of our life story with another human being? Hell, God already knows about it. We know about it. Why tell somebody else? They begin to say, you mean we have to have God remove all of our character defects? Hell, we won't have any personality left if He does. And they begin to talk about, do you mean we have to make amends to all those people we've harmed? And they begin to say such things as, well, maybe we don't need to do every bit of that. Maybe we could take some of it and leave some of it. Maybe we can do it cafeteria style. Pick what we want and leave that we don't want. And came the great advent of the treatment centers. Now, please don't get us wrong. We have nothing against the treatment center. They serve a worthwhile purpose. But in the treatment centers, people begin to hear some other type of words and some other languages. They begin to go therapy thing, and they begin to sit around the tables and talk about their problems, and they begin to develop such terms as a dysfunctional family, and they begin to use such words as chemical dependency, and they begin to talk about significant others, and they begin to discuss meaningful relationships, and they begin to talk about dysfunctional sex. And they begin to talk about this, and they begin to talk about that. And the program in the treatment center wasn't like the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous.
And unfortunately, we still have that issue today in many of our 12-step rooms. The program in the book and the program that are practiced in the 12-step rooms are not the same in many cases. And then these newcomers are coming in, and they want to talk about what they've learned in the treatment centers because, they could connect with it. But it really wasn't the program that was developed in Alcoholics Anonymous, the book that was written by the first 100 or so people.
Program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, naturally, the new people from the treatment centers coming into AA wanted to talk about what they knew to talk about is what they had learned in other places. And slowly, the program and the fellowship began to change. And as the years went by, it began to change more and more and more. We like to refer to those meetings as group depression meetings. You go in there feeling pretty good. Halfway through the meeting, you might as well just go ahead and blow your brains out. Hell, it's not even worth living any longer. Talk about this weekend. It's not the program in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous today. We're going to talk about the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous that the first 100 used, which has never been changed. And the program in the fellowship has definitely changed. The program in the book has never changed.
And we do see that today. So that what I will, I hope that I will pass along to anybody who is listening to this is that you'll take this and then you'll take this back to your own group meetings and start using what the first 100 did to get and stay sober, abstinent, or sane. And the newcomer, we're coming in large numbers, and only, if we go back and we started looking at the AA, truly looking at the AA history, over 50% of the people got sober when they came in. Unfortunately, we can't say that so much today, but back then, 50% of the people that came in actually got sober and stayed sober and remained that way. And 25% sobered up after a couple of relapses. And then others, they showed improvement. That's even better than nothing. So let's see what Joe has to say about that.
20. Let's see how effective this thing used to be when the program in the book and the program in the fellowship were the same.
So while the internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For this, there were two principal reasons: the large number of recoveries and reunited homes. Now, these made their impressions everywhere. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses, and among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Other thousands came to a few AA meetings, at first decided they didn't want the program, but great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3, began to return as time passed.
That's amazing numbers. Unfortunately, we don't have those numbers today, but if we all band together and start taking this information back to our own groups and seeing what we can do, we may get those numbers back up at once. And now let's look a little bit about how the book is laid out. You'll hear Joe talking about the goals of this particular book. And this is also one of the handouts on the right part of your screen there. The goal 1, goal 2, and goal 3. Let's see what they have to say. Now, we only have a couple more slides that are left in here. And we are just now at the top of the hour. So if you can give me maybe 5 more minutes of your time, we will get through these next couple of slides, and then we'll take any questions that you may have.
And the first goal in this book, it tells us what the problem is. That's the goal number 1. And they're going to use the doctor's opinion, Bill's story, basically to tell us what the problem is. And then the second goal is going to be the solution. They're going to give us a solution to the problem that they described. And they know we're going to have problems with that solution just like they did. So they're going to talk chapter 2, there is a solution. Chapter 3, more about alcoholism. The solution has to do with spiritual matters, and they know we're going to have some of those problems. So they wrote down chapter 4 called We Agnostics, for those of us who had problems in that area. Then the third goal is actions necessary for recovery. And we're going to begin with how it works in chapter 5. And chapter 6 is into action. Chapter 7 is working with others. So this book is laid out in particular reasons to bring about certain ideas all the way across, all the way through the book. And that helped me in study the book.
Once again, we look at this from how Bill writes. And if you'll remember at the beginning of this presentation, Joe pointed out that Bill always tells us what the problem is. Then he shares it what the solution is, and then he gives us the program of action that we need to do to be able to achieve that solution. So we have one other screen that I wanted to make sure, or excuse me, one other slide that I wanted to make sure that you hear from Charley about the same thing. It's going to be called the steps. And is what is the problem? What is the solution? What is the program of action necessary to find it? So let's hear what Charley has to say about that.
Chapters correspond with the steps also. And anytime you're studying the big book, you're studying the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. In that doctor's opinion and Bill's story, we're going to see nearly all the information, a little bit of it in chapter 2 and 3, but most of it will be in the doctor's opinion and Bill's story. We'll be able to see everything that we need to in order to see what our problem really is. And we'll be able to see where we're absolutely powerless over alcohol and our lives have become unmanageable. And really, that's step 1. Step one, if we wanted to boil it down to just one word, would be powerless. Then when we can see that powerless condition, then obviously the answer to that's going to be power. And remember, Abby told Bill it has to be the aid of a power greater than human power. So through chapters 2, 3, and 4, we're going to be able to see that power, and we're going to get some new information about spirituality, so we'll be able to come to believe that maybe that power could help us also. And there we're dealing with step 2. That's the power. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Well, if we know we're powerless, and we know we need the power, then the only other thing we need to know is how do you find that power? And that's what chapters 5, 6, and 7 are about. And there we will see the last 10 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And if we follow them, we will have a spiritual awakening. We will have found the power, and we're no longer powerless over alcohol. I read this book for years before I saw that sequence. The same identical sequence that Bill and Bob and the first 100 had to know. What is the problem? Step 1. What is the solution? Step 2. What is the program of action necessary to find it? Steps 3 through 12. Now you begin to study the book in this manner, it becomes a very fascinating book.
Actually, from there, that's going to be the end of what we're going to hear on the recordings, but I did want to just recap really quickly. So far today, we've been through the introduction, got introduced to Bill W. We talked about his vital spiritual experience and how he met Dr. Silkworth and how he was introduced to the Oxford group. We also learned that Dr. Bob was also already attending the Oxford group. And then we talked a little bit about spiritual matters, what was needed. We talked about how Bill went to that bar and was thinking about drinking. And he thought, well, I've been helping other people. It's kept me sober. I think I'll try that again. And then the day before Mother's Day, he reached out, and he was able to connect with Dr. Bob through Henrietta Seiberlin. And then we heard a little bit about how Bill and Bob's first meeting went. It was quite productive. And we talked about the vital spiritual experience, or the spiritual experience. In this case, it was basically Dr. Bob's spiritual experience. Then they had to start working with the third AA person, and that was Bill Dodson. Then we talked a little bit more about how the group had formed, only they didn't know it just yet, and they were calling themselves the Drunk Squad of the Oxford group. And we talked about Bill going back to New York City and developing a second group. And then we talked about a little bit about how the book came together and the effect the treatment centers had on the program Alcoholics Anonymous. And then we talked a little bit about what the newcomer can expect and how the book is laid out and what the steps are. Now, what we didn't cover today is the preface, the algebra problem, and the recovery section. If you look over here, there's a link that's taking you to it that I've used today. In the bottom of the screen there, it'll say introduction and there's an arrow pointing to the right. If you click on that arrow pointing to the right, it will take you to the exact times so that you can listen to this at your own pace. And that's not going to be an issue. And with that, that is the full of my presentation. And I'm going to close with the Serenity Prayer, and then I'll ask Joy to stop the recording, and then we'll take any questions that you might have. After a moment of silence, please join me in the Serenity Prayer.
Thanks for recovering with us.